Hi, Misha here, and last time we looked at the Panzer 6, the Tiger 1, the Kfz.181. And I wanted to give it its own video because it's often overshadowed by its bigger cousin these days. So I wanted to give it its due because far more of these were produced, Tiger 1s, than this here, the Kfz.182 Ost B, the Tiger 2, aka the Bengal Tiger, the Royal Tiger, the King Tiger. This was certainly the largest and heaviest tank that Germany fielded in the war, and really the largest of the war, with some kind of weird exceptions. But despite all of its fame, it was all but a failure, and fewer than 500 were built, and fewer than that were ever actually fielded at any one time. Actually, its service history is quite brief, less than a year. So let's get into it. First up on the spinny thing, we have a 172 diecast model from Forces of Valor. And this one is here because it has the so-called Porsche turret, which isn't really correct. It's actually Krupp, but it's kind of what it's known by. So it's the place to start because this was featured on the first 50 Tiger 2s, this type of turret. And if you think a Tiger 2 is simply a larger, more heavily armed and armored Tiger 1, you could be forgiven for thinking that. But in reality, it's kind of more of a upscaled Panther, one of the Panzer 5s there. At least it has a lot of commonality of parts with the Panther. But that was by design by the Waffen-Amt. And, well, it's big, that's for sure. And this actually goes all the way back to 1941. Now, the roots of the original Tiger went back to 1937, 38. So 41 would be during, of course, the war and right around the time of the beginning of hostilities with Russia and inside Russia and all that. And it started off with a joint project between Porsche and Krupp to design a new turret to house a long-barreled 8.8 centimeter gun, essentially a field gun. And this would evolve into the Porsche design, the Kfz.182 P2. Now, the hull itself was eventually canceled. It would progress to a certain extent, but eventually it would lose out to Hensel because, just like with the Tiger 1, it was too radical. But the turret would kind of remain. The original Porsche design would be ordered in early 42, but canceled by the end of 42. But the turret for it, which involved basically Krupp, would be this style here, sloped, and it was intentionally made very long and narrow, and that was to house the large caliber, very long, very heavy gun. And as Porsche was kind of getting out, Henschel would come in towards the end of 1942, and they would start working on the VK4502. Now, the VK4501H, the Tiger 1, was always an interim solution. They were always hoping to have a larger, more effective breakthrough tank. Now, why they needed one at this point in the war, especially as this actually went into production, who knows? But they thought they did. Now, the O2 would evolve into the O3, and in early 1943, the Ordnance Department pretty much told Hensel to integrate as many elements from the Panther, which was just coming around at the time, into it. So the new design would end up having the same basic engine, transmission, drive system, cooling system, filtration system, and if you remember, a lot of those units had issues with the first Panthers, and of course that would be inherited by the new tank here, as would the turret design. Now essentially the turret design that Krupp worked on for Henschel was more basic, and we'll look at it in a minute. The big difference feature-wise, the Porsche turret was electric powered, and the Henschel design, the H design, was hydraulic powered. This is kind of interesting there. And they were formed using different methods of steel manipulation. But since 100 of the Porsche style turrets, as they're called, were ordered, that's how they would pop into the first tanks here. So they were originally saying, oh, we'll have these in production by July 1943. That didn't happen. It was pushed back to September. Truth is, they didn't start constructing the first real prototype until October, and the first demonstration came on the 20th of that month for the Führer. And from that point, they were put into production. So let's look at the early version here. This is a larger hull, a larger chassis than the Tiger 1. Without the gun, it's 24 feet, and it's about 12 feet wide, and it's over 10 feet tall. And with the main gun, it's 34 feet long, because this is a very long 8.8 centimeter gun. So same bore diameter as the Tiger 1, just much longer. And because of that, it had to be housed in an all-new turret design, very long and narrow, to make it work. Like most German tanks, it had a crew of 5, driver and radio operator and hull machine gunner in the front, and then a 3-man turret. This version here, with this turret, weighed about 68.5 tons, and it carried 80 rounds for the gun, plus over 5,000 rounds for the machine guns, sometimes up to 6,000 rounds depending on the variant. It had an MG-34 in the hull, it had a coaxially mounted one in the turret, and it could have a third one mounted on the roof if needed. The big deal here too was the armor. Like the Panther and the T-34 before it, it had sloped armor. Thickness wise, it was pretty good. Anywhere from about 100 up to about 180, 190 millimeters. So pretty thick armor on paper. It was still the torsion bar suspension with all the wonderful little road wheels. It did use the wider tracks that the Panther used that were borrowed kind of from the Russian tanks, and so on and so forth. Now, just like with the Tiger 1 that used a gasoline engine, so did this. That meant it was very thirsty, and since it's using the same engine as essentially the Panther, its maximum top speed is little under 40 kilometers per hour, and its off-road speed is 15 to 20 kilometers per hour, and it will drink the fuel up very quickly. Fuel that Germany did not have to spare by this time in the war. Now, to its credit, its main gun was very powerful, and it was supplied with a very good optic. Heck, even the hull-mounted machine gun had a telescopic sight, giving it some utility. And at least it was a purpose-built heavy tank. It wasn't kind of put together at least in the beginning, using parts. Although, again, since they wanted them to use more components from the Panther, it kind of got that way, at least to some extent. The transmission and the final drive systems never really did work as well as they should. And of course, it could have the various camo jobs and other finishes of other German tanks at the war's midpoint here. But anyway, 3 prototypes were ordered, 2 were at least used, and they went through testing. It was put into production, and by December of 1943, we started to switch from this pattern of turret, which they were just using up what they had, to the standard production, sometimes called the Henschel pattern, but really, it was just the standard. But it'd still be a little bit before these would go into the field. It just took time. Production numbers were never what they hoped to be, and this was a hugely resource-intensive vehicle to build, even more so than the Tiger 1. Our second model is from Eagle Moss, so it's a pretty inexpensive one, but it does have the standard production turret. You can notice the walls are steeper, and it doesn't have the bulge on the side for the commander's hatch, the cupola. Now, the Porsche style turret, we'll just call it that, did allow things to be a little bit lighter, but it was complicated to manufacture, and the rejection rate and imperfection rate was very high. This style, again designed by Krupp, was just a more conventional turret. It still has some slopes on the sides, but not as much. It also has a redesigned front, so it doesn't act as a bullet trap. And the armor is thicker. And this actually adds quite a bit of weight to the tank. It went from 68.5 tons to not too far under 70 tons. It added nearly 1.3 tons to the overall weight. This is a very massive turret and gun assembly. But it was easier to manufacture, and it had better roof armor if nothing else. It also allowed for 86 shells to be stored instead of 80, so that's good at least. Unless they catch fire, then it's not so good. They would also update the cupola. Originally, it was a modified Tiger 1 type that was welded to the top. During production in 1944, they would go to a bolt-on style, so easier to replace and maintain. Again, only the first 50 or so had the old style turret. The rest of production, beginning in December of 43 and onwards, would have the new. So, what else to say about it while I'm here? It's just a big beast, and it does certainly have thick armor on paper. And they were hoping to have over 100 ready by May of 1944. As of June 1st, they had 5. Production was not going the way they planned. So it effectively was not there for D-Day, because even the 5 they had on the Western Front were not really fully operational. These were having major mechanical issues because you've got an already not great engine and transmission in a tank probably twice the weight they were originally intended for. So, yeah, what do you think was going to happen? These were first deployed against the Allies in July of 1944, and then just under a month later against the Soviets in August. There are individual accounts of Tiger 2s taking out 10 or more enemy tanks. Those are the exceptions, not the rules. For the most part, these would break down, get stuck, and have to be abandoned. Or simply the fact that they're so long, some of them would get stuck on the side of a building with their gun. Even if that wasn't the case, the crews at this time were so young and inexperienced, they would make mistakes that led to them just, being destroyed. In fact, some of these were penetrated by as little as like 76 millimeter guns. It just depended. No matter how good of a tank you design, if your crews aren't up to snuff, it's not going to happen. And for our third 172 scale diecast model, we have one from, I forget it's Atlas or Altea. They're all the same. So it's kind of in the middle of the road as far as quality goes. They were actually able to start producing these in reasonable numbers towards the middle and end of 1944, especially once they pulled the Tiger 1 out of production that summer. Again, these are designated as the Kfz.182, and there would be command tank versions again as the 267 and 268. And they were detached in heavy battalions, just like with the Tiger 1. And they were sometimes even serving alongside each other, because they rarely, if ever, had enough Tiger 2s to support. It will come as no surprise that bombing raids slowed production more than a few times over the runs. The Hinchdale factory was actually very severely damaged in the fall and winter of 1944, and production really crawled to a halt. Nevertheless, for the Battle of the Bulge, probably the biggest assemblage of these would happen when they had about 150 available, although not all would be running it all at one time. So this could have been a pretty terrifying force for the Allies, but it wasn't. Through mechanical faults, ill-trained crews, low morale, they mostly were just lost. Of those 150, most of them were destroyed. And the same thing was happening on the Eastern Front. Now, that's not to say the tank did not have some positives. This main gun, well, German manuals said at 1,000 meters it was 100% accurate. At 1,500 meters, 95. And at 2,000 meters, 85% accurate. Well, those are kind of ideal conditions and a little bit of propaganda. But in reality, it was a very accurate gun. 80, 70, 60%, depending on range. And it had very good range and penetration. It could punch through 200 millimeters of armor, or even 100 and some odd at 2 kilometers. Is a very big shell. So, in theory, its own armor should have been able to repulse just about everything. But by this point, poor quality control, unskilled labor in the factories, even sabotage, and just low-grade metals took their toll. Testing during and after the war revealed that the welds would break very easily, that the armor plates would crack or cause spalling inside, and that they were frankly just too brittle. They just, even though it was very thick armor and it was sloped, because of the quality and how it was assembled, it didn't live up to what it should have done. That said, in the front, it could, repulse an 85 millimeter round. And even the sides weren't bad. They could easily repulse a 76 millimeter shell. But lucky shots do happen. And it's hard to just say categorically, because that's how combat works. Individual instances just happen like that. Especially when your tank can very easily just break down. Doesn't really matter how good your armor is. And that's kind of what this was. It was well armored and had a good gun. So in a stationary position, it did pretty good. But when you ever needed it to move, that's when the problems kind of started. Snow and mud would get in the complicated track system. You could overheat the engine. You had less and less high quality fuel available in Germany in 1944 and 45, and this thing was the definition of a gas guzzler. And fuel prices in Germany were even higher than they are in America today. So take that as you will. The Battle of the Bulge would be pretty much the last big assemblage of these. And because of bombing raids, the factory would actually turn out 0 in January, although they would produce some in February, and even some in March before the Allies captured the factory. But, yeah. A lot of the ones that were in the West were transferred to the East in 1945, and they were just ground up in the warfare on the Eastern Front. And that was pretty much it. Again, there are some impressive individual accounts of these having a better than 10-to-1 kill ratio. And even at the end, German tanks would dish out more than they took in. The win-to-lose ratio was still in their favor by the strict numbers against the Russians. The problem is production capacity. They just could not keep up, and there's no wonder about that. Russia produced over 80,000 T-34s alone, and Germany made not quite 1,400 Tiger 1s and between 400 and 500 Tiger 2s, and of those, many never made it to the front. And of the not quite 1,800 built, 1,700 were just outright lost in combat. So by war's end, there wasn't a huge market for scrapping and salvaging these because very few were left running. Again, they were ground up on the Eastern Front and on the Western Front too. The Allies just outproduced them, and it was definitely a quantity over quality. But even then, the quality of the Tiger is debatable. On paper, in theory, yes, very good quality for 1 or 2. But in practice and actual production, how they were made versus how they were supposed to be made, and how their crews operated versus how they were supposed to operate, that's where, the book versus reality comes into play. And I think that's where a lot of the myth of the Wehrmacht comes in. And by 1944-45, they were tired of fighting, demoralized, and their country was in shambles. Yet, they started wanting to make monsters like these at the end of the war. In fact, there's even one more, if they'd had time, they might have made. I'm, of course, talking about the Panzer VII, the Mouse. Yeah, anyway, I could go on and on. But I did want to talk about the Tigers. And they are definitely interesting pieces of history. I will give them that. These Forces of Valor models are very nice. The front gun, the little machine gun moves. The main gun moves, and you got a commander popping out of the turret. The precision model art we looked at last time has a lot of cool features, including a full interior. So if nothing else, they're fun to study from that point of view, of that perspective. Well, we're essentially at the end of the German tanks. We've covered the light tanks, the medium tanks, the heavy tanks. Of course, eventually we might get into the Jagdpanzers and Jagdtigers and Jaegers and, oh boy, the Martyrs, and there's all kinds of fun stuff to still talk about, because it seems like whereas the Americans and Russians kind of standardized T-34s and M4s with, a few deviations, but that's pretty much it. The Germans just decided to make a few hundred of this, a few hundred of that, and, standardization, who needs it, right? Well, I hope you enjoyed this. If you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.